When Jesus was just a young boy, so maybe around kindergarten age, this is around the year 5 or 6 CE, there was a rebellion in Galilee that was brutally suppressed by the Roman Empire. And as a result of this rebellion or revolt, some 2,000 Galilean insurrectionists were crucified on the streets leading up to Galilee. Just imagine that for a second. Thousands of bodies hanging from crosses as they slowly died over the course of a few days. And just imagine the impression it might have made on a young Jesus, and also his future followers, who were probably also children at the time. In the first century, the cross was the scariest and the worst thing that could possibly happen to somebody. We've gotten so accustomed to seeing it in churches, but for somebody in the first century who walked into a worship space and saw a cross, it'd be like us today walking into a church or a worship space and seeing like a guillotine or an electric chair hanging above the altar. The cross in the first century and crucifixion in the first century represented death and suffering, disgrace and humiliation. It represented the might and the power of the Roman Empire. So I can understand when Peter and the other disciples were probably a bit shocked, if not horrified, when Jesus explained to them that he, Jesus, was going to have to suffer and die, and that if his disciples really wanted to be his followers, they would have to take up their cross and follow him. This morning's gospel lesson is part of an important turning point in Mark's gospel. In the verses that come right before this morning's gospel lesson, it's the first time in Mark's gospel when one of the disciples, Peter, recognizes Jesus as the Messiah. So up until this point in Mark's gospel, Jesus has been running around all over Galilee. He's been healing the diseased and disabled. He's been telling parables. He fed a few thousand people with just a few scraps of food and some fish. He was even walking on water at some point. But still, it wasn't entirely clear who this Jesus guy was to the people around him. But in the verses that come right before this morning's gospel lesson, Jesus asked that very famous question: "Who do you say I am?" And Peter responds by saying, "You are the Messiah." Now, there were a number of different expectations in the first century about what the Messiah was going to look like and what exactly the Messiah was going to do. But the basic idea that was prevalent among the Jewish communities in the first century was that the Messiah was going to deliver the Jewish people from Roman occupation. Okay, this is all starting to sound pretty good, right? This Jesus guy, all these things that he's been doing before, the miracles and the healings, these are all part of the work of the Messiah who is going to deliver the people from Roman occupation. But where our gospel lesson picks up this morning, we hear the disturbing follow-up about this Messiah. Jesus tells his disciples that he, the Son of Man, this newly proclaimed Messiah, is going to have to suffer and die. Wait, what? A Messiah who's going to suffer and die? That's not how things are supposed to go. Can't you just kind of imagine it? Peter takes Jesus aside to kind of set him straight. Whoa, Jesus. Suffering and death are not part of the messianic agenda. Power and might and strength are part of the messianic agenda. If we're going to have to liberate the people from Roman occupation, we got a lot of work to do here, pal. And Peter rebukes Jesus. And that's a strong word. That word, rebukes, pops up a few other times in Mark's gospel. We hear how Jesus rebukes demons and unclean spirits When Jesus is caught in a storm on a boat with his disciples, he rebukes the waves and the wind. Jesus' disciples, when people are overeager to get to Jesus, they rebuke these overeager people. It's definitely not a term that's appropriate to use with your teacher and your rabbi. But it shows just how upset Peter was, just how frazzled he was. He wasn't hoping for a Messiah that was going to suffer and die. He was hoping for a Messiah that would live into these traditional expectations of messiahship. Like kingdom and power and might and strength and victory. Those were the things that he was hoping for. And I can kind of get it. Can kind of get where Peter is coming from. I know for myself, I often get frazzled and upset when things don't go the way that I was hoping for. And I can't even imagine what it must have been like for Peter, who had been with Jesus through so much, who had just proclaimed him as the Messiah, and to hear something so contrary to what he was expecting. Peter's rebuke of Jesus reflects our humanly way of thinking, that victory comes through power and strength and might, not through suffering and death. Peter was blinded by his own preconceptions of who the Messiah should be. But Jesus is very clear, even if it was difficult for Peter to hear, even if it's difficult for us to hear now, that suffering and death are an important part of who he is. That his suffering and death at the hands of a brutal Roman Empire show us another way. They show us a new way to be in the world around us. When he's confronted with a power system based in violence, that's based in domination and exploitation, Jesus is going to continue to do what Jesus has always done. He's going to continue to forgive. He's going to continue to heal, to reconcile us to each other and to God, and to give himself freely to others in love. Not even the worst that humanity can do can stop Jesus from exercising a kind of divine love. Jesus never retaliates. He never resorts to violence, but he keeps living this kind of godly love. Not even the worst that humanity can do can defeat this kind of love. Rowan Williams, a guy I talk about a lot. You're probably sick of hearing me talk about him because I talk about him so much, but I like him a whole lot, so you're going to hear a little bit more about him today. He explains that discipleship, what it means to be a follower of Jesus, involves having an inner stillness that allows us to be aware and attentive to God's love and God's presence in the world around us. And he explains that discipleship is about being in the company of Jesus, going to where Jesus goes. And Williams goes on to explain that Jesus often goes to those places that we don't want to go to, that we're uncomfortable going to, places of suffering, places where people are in need, the forgotten and the marginalized. In this morning's lesson, Jesus tells his disciples that if they want to be his followers, they need to deny themselves and take up their cross and follow him. Talk about going to a place where you don't want to go or that makes you uncomfortable. I talked a little bit about the beginning of this sermon, how Jesus and the disciples knew exactly what the cross meant and what it represented. Jesus calls his disciples to face the scariest and the worst thing that they can imagine and then that the Roman Empire can throw at them, with the confidence that nothing separates them from the love of God. Not even the cross is going to stop God's love from getting to God's people. It flies in the face of the Roman Empire and systems of injustices everywhere. Jesus' invitation to take up their cross flies in the face of systems of injustice everywhere. When we face our fears and our anxieties with the confidence that God's love is always with us, that nothing is going to get in the way of God's love, it frees us to follow Jesus and to participate in this way of life that he's making known, to exercise this selfless love with the people around us, in our own communities, and in the world around us. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think that's an easy thing for us to do all the time. At least I know that's not an easy thing for me to do all the time. I think our own preconceptions and prejudices of how things should be, or the way things should be, or what is going to be best, often get in our way from fully recognizing and hearing Jesus' message and his teaching of what he's trying to get through to us. I think we too rebuke Jesus in our own, much more subtle ways, when we choose to neglect or gloss over those aspects of Jesus' life and teaching that might make us uncomfortable or call us to places where we don't want to go. When we continue to participate in violent systems that exploit and marginalize others. During this season of Lent, we are offered the opportunity to reflect on our own lives, our own preconceptions, and our own prejudices, and how they prevent us from being aware of God's love that knows no bounds and that calls us to exercise a kind of selfless love in our own lives. Amen.